The Story of Civilization, Volume 1, Our Oriental Heritage, Part 2, by Will Durant, continued. Cassette 6, Side 2. Mozi, said his enemy, Mencius, loved all men and would gladly wear out his whole being from head to heel for the benefit of mankind. He was a native of Lu, like Confucius, and flourished shortly after the passing of the sage. He condemned the impracticality of Confucius's thought and offered to replace it by exhorting all men to love one another. He was among the earliest of Chinese logicians and the worst of Chinese reasoners. He stated the problem of logic with great simplicity. These are what I call the 3 laws of reasoning. 1. Where to find the foundation. Find it in the study of the experiences of the wisest men of the past. 2. How to take a general survey of it. Examine the facts of the actual experience of the people. 3. How to apply it. Put it into law and governmental policy and see whether or not it is conducive to the welfare of the state and the people. On this basis, Mozi proceeded to prove that ghosts and spirits are real, for many people have seen them. He objected strongly to Confucius's coldly impersonal view of heaven and argued for the personality of God. Like Pascal, he thought religion a good wager. If the ancestors to whom we sacrifice hear us, we have made a good bargain. If they are quite dead and unconscious of our offerings, the sacrifice gives us an opportunity to gather our relatives and neighbors and participate in the enjoyment of the sacrificial victuals and drinks. In the same manner, reasons Mozi, universal love is the only solution of the social problem, for if it were applied, there is no doubt that it would bring utopia. Men in general loving one another, the strong would not make prey of the weak, the many would not plunder the few, the rich would not insult the poor, the noble would not be insolent to the mean, and the deceitful would not impose upon the simple. Selfishness is the source of all evil, from the acquisitiveness of the child to the conquest of an empire. Mozi marvels that a man who steals a pig is universally condemned and generally punished, while a man who invades and appropriates a kingdom is a hero to his people and a model to posterity. From this pacifism, Mozi advanced to such vigorous criticism of the state that his doctrine verged on anarchism and frightened the authorities. Once, his biographers assure us, when the state engineer of the kingdom of Zhu was about to invade the state of Sung in order to test a new siege ladder which he had invented, Mozi dissuaded him by preaching to him his doctrine of universal love and peace. "Before I met you," said the engineer, "I had wanted to conquer the state of Sung. But since I have seen you, I would not have it even if it were given to me without resistance, but with no just cause." "If so," replied Mozi, "it is as if I had already given you the state of Sung. Do persist in your righteous course, and I will give you the whole world." The Confucian scholars, as well as the politicians of Luoyang, met these amiable proposals with laughter. Nevertheless, Mozi had his followers, and for 2 centuries his views became the religion of a pacifist sect. 2 of his disciples, Sung Ping and Kung Sun Lung, waged active campaigns for disarmament. Han Fei, the greatest critic of his age, attacked the movement from what we might call a Nietzschean standpoint, arguing that until men had actually sprouted the wings of universal love, war would continue to be the arbiter of nations. When Shi Huang ordered his famous burning of the books, the literature of Mohism was cast into the flames along with the volumes of Confucius, and unlike the writings and doctrines of the master, the new religion did not survive the conflagration. 2. Yang Zhu, egoist. An Epicurean determinist, the case for wickedness. Meanwhile, a precisely opposite doctrine had found vigorous expression among the Chinese. Yang Zhu, of whom we know nothing except through the mouths of his enemies, announced paradoxically that life is full of suffering, and that its chief purpose is pleasure. "There is no God," said Yang, "and no afterlife. Men are the helpless puppets of the blind natural forces that made them, and that gave them their unchosen ancestry and their inalienable character. The wise man will accept this fate without complaint, but will not be fooled by all the nonsense of Confucius and Mozi about inherent virtue, universal love, and a good name. Morality is a deception practiced upon the simple by the clever. Universal love is the delusion of children who do not know the universal enmity that forms the law of life. And a good name is a posthumous bauble which the fools who paid so dearly for it cannot enjoy. In life the good suffer like the bad, and the wicked seem to enjoy themselves more keenly than the good. The wisest men of antiquity were not moralists and rulers, as Confucius supposed, but sensible sensualists who had the good fortune to antedate the legislators and the philosophers and who enjoyed the pleasures of every impulse. It is true that the wicked sometimes leave a bad name behind them, but this is a matter that does not disturb their bones. Consider, says Yang Zhu, the fate of the good and the evil. All agree in considering Shun, Yu, Zhou Kung, and Confucius to have been the most admirable of men, and Jie and Zhou the most wicked. Now Shun had to plow the ground on the south of the Ho, and to play the potter by the Lei Lake. His forelimbs had not even a temporary rest. For his mouth and belly he could not even find pleasant food and warm clothing. No love of his parents rested upon him, no affection of his brothers and sisters. When Yao at length resigned to him the throne, he was advanced in age, his wisdom was decayed, his son, Shang-chun, proved without ability, and he had finally to resign the throne to Yu. Sorrowfully came he to his death. Of all mortals never was one whose life was so worn out and empoisoned as his. All the energies of Yu were spent on his labors with the land. A child was born to him, but he could not foster it. He passed his door without entering. His body became bent and withered. The skin of his hands and feet became thick and callous. When at length Shun resigned to him the throne, he lived in a low, mean house, though his sacrificial apron and cap were elegant. Sorrowfully came he to his death. Of all mortals never was one whose life was so saddened and embittered as his. Confucius understood the ways of the ancient sovereigns and kings. He responded to the invitations of the princes of his time. The tree was cut down over him in Sung. The traces of his footsteps were removed in Wei. He was reduced to extremity in Shang and Zhou. He was surrounded in Chan and Ci. He was disgraced by Yang Hu. Sorrowfully came he to his death. Of all mortals never was one whose life was so agitated and hurried as his. These four sages during their lives had not a single day's joy. Since their death they have had a fame that will last through myriads of ages, but that fame is what no one who cares for what is real would choose. Celebrate them, they do not know it. Reward them, they do not know it. Their fame is no more to them than to the trunk of a tree or a clod of earth. On the other hand, Jie came into the accumulated wealth of many generations. To him belonged the honor of the royal seat. His wisdom was enough to enable him to set at defiance all below. His power was enough to shake the world. He indulged the pleasures to which his eyes and ears prompted him. He carried out whatever it came into his thoughts to do. Brightly came he to his death. Of all mortals never was one whose life was so luxurious and dissipated as his. Zhou, Xin, came into the accumulated wealth of many generations. To him belonged the honor of the royal seat. His power enabled him to do whatever he would. He indulged his feelings in all his palaces. He gave the reins to his lusts through the long night. He never made himself bitter by the thought of propriety and righteousness. Brightly came he to his destruction. Of all mortals never was one whose life was as abandoned as his. These two villains, during their lives, had the joy of gratifying their desires. Since their death, they have had the evil fame of folly and tyranny, but the reality of enjoyment is what no fame can give. Reproach them, they do not know it. Praise them, they do not know it. Their ill fame is no more to them than the trunk of a tree or a clod of earth. How different all this is from Confucius. Again, we suspect that Time, who is a reactionary, has preserved for us the most respectable of Chinese thinkers, and has swallowed nearly all the rest in the limbo of forgotten souls. And perhaps Time is right. Humanity itself could not long survive if many were of Yang Zhu's mind. The only answer to him is that society cannot exist if the individual does not cooperate with his followers in the give and take, the bear and forbear, of moral restraints. And the developed individual cannot exist without society. Our life depends upon those very limitations that constrain us. Some historians have found in the spread of such egoist philosophies part cause of that disintegration which marked Chinese society in the 4th and 3rd centuries before Christ. No wonder that Mencius, the Dr. Johnson of his age, raised his voice in scandalized protest against the Epicureanism of Yang Zhu, as well as against the idealism of Mozi. The words of Yang Zhu and Mozi fill the world. If you listen to people's discourses about it, you will find that they have adopted the views of the one or the other. Now Yang's principle is each for himself, which does not acknowledge the claims of the sovereign. Mo's principle is to love all equally, which does not acknowledge the peculiar affection due to a father. To acknowledge neither king nor father is to be in the state of a beast. If their principles are not stopped and the principles of Confucius set forth, their perverse speaking will delude the people and stop up the path of benevolence and righteousness. I am alarmed by these things and address myself to the defense of the doctrines of the former sages and to oppose Yang and Mo. I drive away their licentious expressions, so that such perverse speakers may not be able to show themselves. When sages shall rise up again, they will not change my words. 3. Mencius, mentor of princes. A model mother, a philosopher among kings. Are men by nature good? Single tax, Mencius and the communists, the profit motive, the right of revolution. Mencius, destined to be second in fame to Confucius alone in the rich annals of Chinese philosophy, belonged to the ancient family of Mang. His name, Mang Ko, was changed by an imperial decree to Mang Tse, that is, Mang the master or philosopher, and the Latin-trained scholars of Europe transformed him into Mencius, as they had changed Kung Fu Tse into Confucius. We know the mother of Mencius almost as intimately as we know him, for Chinese historians, who have made her famous as a model of maternity, recount many pretty stories of her. Thrice, we are told, she changed her residence on his account, once because they lived near a cemetery and the boy began to behave like an undertaker, another time because they lived near a slaughterhouse and the boy imitated too well the cries of the slain animals, and again because they lived near a marketplace and the boy began to act the part of a tradesman. Finally, she found a home near a school and was satisfied. When the boy neglected his studies, she cut through in his presence the thread of her shuttle, and when he asked why she did so destructive a thing, she explained that she was but imitating his own negligence and the lack of continuity in his studies and his development. He became an assiduous student, married, resisted the temptation to divorce his wife, opened a school of philosophy, gathered a famous collection of students about him, and received invitations from various princes to come and discuss with them his theories of government. He hesitated to leave his mother in her old age, but she sent him off with a speech that endeared her to all Chinese males, and may have been composed by one of them. It does not belong to a woman to determine anything of herself, but she is subject to the rule of the 3 obediences. When young, she has to obey her parents. When married, she has to obey her husband. When a widow, she has to obey her son. You are a man in your full maturity, and I am old. Do you act as your conviction of righteousness tells you you ought to do, and I will act according to the rule which belongs to me. Why should you be anxious about me? He went, for the itch to teach is a part of the itch to rule. Scratch the one and find the other. Like Voltaire, Mencius preferred monarchy to democracy, on the ground that in democracy it is necessary to educate all if the government is to succeed, while under monarchy it is only required that the philosopher should bring one man, the king, to wisdom, in order to produce the perfect state. Correct what is wrong in the prince's mind. Once rectify the prince, and the kingdom will be settled. He went first to Qi, and tried to rectify its Prince Xuan. He accepted an honorary office, but refused the salary that went with it, and soon finding that the prince was not interested in philosophy, he withdrew to the small principality of Tang, whose ruler became a sincere but ineffectual pupil. Mencius returned to Qi, and proved his growth in wisdom and understanding by accepting a lucrative office from Prince Xuan. When, during these comfortable years, his mother died, he buried her with such pomp that his pupils were scandalized. He explained to them that it was only a sign of his filial devotion. Some years later, Xuan set out upon a war of conquest, and, resenting Mencius's untimely pacifism, terminated his employment. Hearing that the Prince of Sung had expressed his intention of ruling like a philosopher, Mencius journeyed to his court, but found that the report had been exaggerated. Like the men invited to an ancient wedding feast, the various princes had many excuses for not being rectified. "I have an infirmity," one of them said. "I love valor." "I have an infirmity," said another. "I am fond of wealth." Mencius retired from public life, and gave his declining years to the instruction of students and the composition of a work in which he described his conversations with the royalty of his time. We cannot tell to what extent these should be classed with those of Walter Savage Landor, nor do we know whether this composition was the work of Mencius himself, or of his pupils, or of neither, or of both. We can only say that the Book of Mencius is one of the most highly honored of China's philosophical classics. His doctrine is as severely secular as that of Confucius. There is little here about logic, or epistemology, or metaphysics. The Confucians left such subtleties to the followers of Lao Tse, and confined themselves to moral and political speculation. What interests Mencius is the charting of the good life and the establishment of government by good men. His basic claim is that men are by nature good, and that the social problem arises not out of the nature of men, but out of the wickedness of governments. Hence philosophers must become kings, or the kings of this world must become philosophers. Now, if your majesty will institute a government whose action will be benevolent, this will cause all the officers in the kingdom to wish to stand in your majesty's court, and all the farmers to wish to plough in your majesty's fields, and all the merchants to wish to store their goods in your majesty's marketplaces, and all traveling strangers to wish to make their tours on your majesty's roads, and all throughout the kingdom who feel aggrieved by their rulers to wish to come and complain to your majesty. And when they are so bent, who will be able to keep them back? The king said, I am stupid, and not able to advance to this. The good ruler would war not against other countries, but against the common enemy, poverty, for it is out of poverty and ignorance that crime and disorder come. To punish men for crimes committed as the result of a lack of opportunities offered them for employment is a dastardly trap to set for the people. A government is responsible for the welfare of its people and should regulate economic processes accordingly. It should tax chiefly the ground itself, rather than what is built or done on it. It should abolish all tariffs, and should develop universal and compulsory education as the soundest basis of a civilized development. Good laws are not equal to winning the people by good instruction. That whereby man differs from the lower animals is but small. Most people throw it away. Only superior men preserve it. We perceive how old are the political problems, attitudes, and solutions of our enlightened age when we learn that Mencius was rejected by the princes for his radicalism and was scorned for his conservatism by the socialists and communists of his time. When the shrike-tongued barbarian of the South, Shu Xing, raised the flag of the proletarian dictatorship, demanding that working men should be made the heads of the state, the magistrates, said Shu, should be laboring men, and many of the learned, then as now, flocked to the new standard, Mencius rejected the idea scornfully and argued that government should be in the hands of educated men. But he denounced the profit motive in human society and rebuked Sun Kang for proposing to win the kings to pacifism by persuading them, in modern style, of the unprofitableness of war. Your aim is great, but your argument is not good. If you, starting from the point of profit, offer your persuasive counsels to the kings of Qin and Qi, and if those kings are pleased with the consideration of profit so as to stop the movements of their armies, then all belonging to those armies will rejoice in the cessation of war, and will find their pleasures in the pursuit of profit. Ministers will serve the sovereign for the profit of which they cherish the thought. Sons will serve their fathers, and younger brothers will serve their elder brothers from the same consideration. And the issue will be that, abandoning benevolence and righteousness, sovereign and minister, father and son, younger brother and elder, will carry on all their intercourse with this thought of profit cherished in their breasts. But never has there been such a state of society without ruin being the result of it. He recognized the right of revolution and preached it in the face of kings. He denounced war as a crime and shocked the hero worshippers of his time by writing, "There are men who say, 'I am skillful at marshalling troops. I am skillful at conducting a battle.' They are great criminals." There has never been a good war, he said. He condemned the luxury of the courts and sternly rebuked the king who fed his dogs and swine while famine was consuming his people. When a king argued that he could not prevent famine, Mencius told him that he should resign. The people, he taught, are the most important element in a nation. The sovereign is the lightest. And the people have the right to depose their rulers, even, now and then, to kill them. The King Xuan asked about the high ministers. Mencius answered, "If the princes have great faults, they ought to remonstrate with him, and if he do not listen to them after they have done so again and again, they ought to dethrone him." Mencius proceeded, "Suppose that the chief criminal judge could not regulate the officers under him. How would you deal with him?" The king said, "Dismiss him." Mencius again said, "If within the four borders of your kingdom there is not good government, what is to be done?" The king looked to the right and left and spoke of other matters. The King Xuan asked, "Was it so that Dong banished Jie, and that King Wu smote Zhou?" Mencius replied, "It is so in the records." The king said, "May a minister put his sovereign to death?" Mencius said, "He who outrages the benevolence proper to his nature is called a robber. He who outrages righteousness is called a ruffian. The robber and the ruffian we call a mere fellow. I have heard of the cutting off of the fellow, Joe, but I have not heard of putting a sovereign to death. It was brave doctrine, and had much to do with the establishment of the principle, recognized by the kings as well as the people of China, that a ruler who arouses the enmity of his people has lost the mandate of heaven, and may be removed. It is not to be marveled at that Hung Wu, founder of the Ming dynasty, having read with great indignation the conversations of Mencius with King Xuan, ordered Mencius to be degraded from his place in the Temple of Confucius, where a royal edict of 1084 had erected his tablet. But within a year the tablet was restored, and until the Revolution of 1911 Mencius remained one of the heroes of China, the second great name and influence in the history of Chinese orthodox philosophy. To him and to Chu Shi, Confucius owed his intellectual leadership of China for more than 2,000 years. 4. Xunzi, realist. The evil nature of man, the necessity of law. There were many weaknesses in Mencius's philosophy, and his contemporaries exposed them with a fierce delight. Was it true that men were by nature good, and were led to evil only by wicked institutions? Or was human nature itself responsible for the ills of society? Here was an early formulation of a conflict that has raged for some eons between reformers and conservatives. Does education diminish crime, increase virtue, and lead men into utopia? Are philosophers fit to govern states, or do their theories worse confound the confusion which they seek to cure? The ablest and most hard-headed of Mencius's critics was a public official who seems to have died at the age of 70, about the year 235 B.C. As Mencius had believed human nature to be good in all men, so Xunzi believed it to be bad in all men. Even Shun and Yao were savages at birth. Shun, in the fragment that remains of him, writes like another Hobbes. The nature of man is evil. The good which it shows is factitious. There belongs to it even at his birth the love of gain. And as actions are in accordance with this, contentions and robberies grow up, and self-denial and yielding to others are not to be found by nature. There belong to it envy and dislike, and as actions are in accordance with these, violence and injuries spring up, and self-devotedness and faith are not to be found. There belong to it the desires of the ears and the eyes, leading to the love of sounds and beauty, and as the actions are in accordance with these, lewdness and disorder spring up, and righteousness and propriety, with their various orderly displays, are not to be found. It thus appears that to follow man's nature and yield obedience to its feelings will assuredly conduct to contentions and robberies, to the violation of the duties belonging to everyone's lot, and the confounding of all distinctions, till the issue will be a state of savagery, and that there must be the influence of teachers and laws, and the guidance of propriety and righteousness, from which will spring self-denial, yielding to others, and an observance of the well-ordered regulations of conduct, till the issue will be a state of good government. The sage kings of antiquity, understanding that the nature of man was thus evil, set up the principles of righteousness and propriety, and framed laws and regulations to straighten and ornament the feelings of that nature and correct them, so that they might all go forth in the way of moral government and in agreement with reason. Xunzi concluded, like Turgenev, that nature is not a temple but a workshop. She provides the raw material, but intelligence must do the rest. By proper training, he thought, these naturally evil men might be transformed even into saints, if that should be desirable. Being also a poet, he put Francis Bacon into doggerel. You glorify nature and meditate on her. Why not domesticate her and regulate her? You obey nature and sing her praise. Why not control her course and use it? You look upon the seasons with reverence and await them. Why not respond to them by seasonly activities? You depend on things and marvel at them. Why not unfold your own ability and transform them? 5. Zhuangzi, idealist. The return to nature, governmentless society, the way of nature, the limits of the intellect, the evolution of man, the button molder, the influence of Chinese philosophy in Europe. The return to nature, however, could not be so readily discouraged. It found voice in this age as in every other, and by what might be called a natural accident, its exponent was the most eloquent writer of his time. Zhuangzi, loving nature as the only mistress who always welcomed him, whatever his infidelities or his age, poured into his philosophy the poetic sensitivity of a Rousseau, and yet sharpened it with the satiric wit of a Voltaire. Who could imagine Mencius so far forgetting himself as to describe a man as having a large goiter like an earthenware jar? Zhuang belongs to literature as well as to philosophy. He was born in the province of Sung and held minor office for a time in the city of Qiyuan. He visited the same courts as Mencius, but neither in his extant writings mentions the other's name. Perhaps they loved each other like contemporaries. Story has it that he refused high office twice. When the Duke of Wei offered him the prime ministry, he dismissed the royal messengers with a curtness indicative of a writer's dreams. "Go away quickly, and do not soil me with your presence. I had rather amuse and enjoy myself in a filthy ditch than be subject to the rules and restrictions in the court of a sovereign." While he was fishing, 2 great officers brought him a message from the king of Ku. "I wish to trouble you with the charge of all my territories." Zhuang tells us, answered without turning away from his fishing. "I have heard that in Ku there is a spirit like tortoiseshell, the wearer of which died 3,000 years ago, and which the king keeps in his ancestral temple in a hamper covered with a cloth. Was it better for the tortoise to die and leave its shell to be thus honored, or would it have been better for it to live and keep on dragging its tail after it over the mud?" The 2 officers said it would have been better for it to live and draw its tail after it over the mud. "Go your ways," said Zhuang. "I will keep on dragging my tail after me through the mud." His respect for governments equaled that of his spiritual ancestor, Lao Tse. He took delight in pointing out how many qualities kings and governors shared with thieves. If by some negligence on his part a true philosopher should find himself in charge of a state, his proper course would be to do nothing, and allow men in freedom to build their own organs of self-government. "I have heard of letting the world be, and exercising forbearance. I have not heard of governing the world." The Golden Age, which preceded the earliest kings, had no government, and Yao and Shun, instead of being so honored by China and Confucius, should be charged with having destroyed the primitive happiness of mankind by introducing government. In the age of perfect virtue, men lived in common with birds and beasts, and were on terms of equality with all creatures as forming one family. How could they know among themselves the distinctions of superior men and small men? The wise man, thinks Zhuang, will take to his heels at the first sign of government, and will live as far as possible from both philosophers and kings. He will court the peace and silence of the woods — here was a theme that 1,000 Chinese painters would seek to illustrate — and let his whole being, without any impediment of artifice or thought, follow the divine Tao, the law and flow of nature's inexplicable life. He would be sparing of words, for words mislead as often as they guide, and the Tao, the way and the essence of nature, can never be phrased in words or formed in thought. It can only be felt by the blood. He would reject the aid of machinery, preferring the older, more burdensome ways of simpler men. For machinery makes complexity, turbulence, and inequality, and no man can live among machines and achieve peace. He would avoid the ownership of property, and would find no use in his life for gold. Like Timon, he would let the gold lie hidden in the hills, and the pearls remain unsought in the deep. His distinction is in understanding that all things belong to the one treasury, and that death and life should be viewed in the same way, as harmonious measures in the rhythm of nature, waves of one sea. The center of Zhuang's thought, as of the thought of that half-legendary Lao Tse who seemed to him so much profounder than Confucius, was a mystic vision of an impersonal unity, so strangely akin to the doctrines of Buddha and the Upanishads that one is tempted to believe that Indian metaphysics had found its way into China long before the recorded coming of Buddhism 400 years later. It is true that Zhuang is an agnostic, a fatalist, a determinist, and a pessimist, but this does not prevent him from being a kind of skeptical saint, a Tao-intoxicated man. He expresses his skepticism characteristically in a story. The penumbra said to the umbra, "At one moment you move, at another you are at rest. At one moment you sit down, at another you get up. Why this instability of purpose?" "I depend," replied the umbra, "upon something which causes me to do as I do, and that something depends upon something else which causes it to do as it does. How can I tell you why I do one thing or do not do another? When the body is decomposed, the mind will be decomposed along with it. Must not the case be pronounced very deplorable? The change, the rise and dissolution of all things continually goes on, but we do not know who it is that maintains and continues the process. How do we know when any one begins? How do we know when he will end? We have simply to wait for it, and nothing more." In an eclipse, The penumbra is the partly illuminated space between the umbra, the complete shadow, and the light. Perhaps in Chuang's allegory the complete shadow is the body, interrogated by the partly illuminated mind. These problems, Chuang suspects, are due less to the nature of things than to the limits of our thought. It is not to be wondered at that the effort of our imprisoned brains to understand the cosmos of which they are such minute particles should end in contradictions, antinomies, and befuddlement. This attempt to explain the whole in terms of the part has been a gigantic immodesty, forgivable only on the ground of the amusement which it has caused. For humor, like philosophy, is a view of the part in terms of the whole, and neither is possible without the other. The intellect, says Zhuangzi, can never avail to understand ultimate things or any profound thing, such as the growth of a child. Disputation is a proof of not seeing clearly, and in order to understand the Tao, one must sternly suppress one's knowledge. We have to forget our theories and feel the fact. Education is of no help towards such understanding. Submersion in the flow of nature is all important. What is the Tao that the rare and favored mystic sees? It is inexpressible in words. Weakly and with contradictions we describe it as the unity of all things, their quiet flow from origin to fulfillment, and the law that governs that flow. Before there were heaven and earth, from of old it was, securely existing. In that cosmic unity all contradictions are resolved, all distinctions fade, all opposites meet. Within it and from its standpoint there is no good or bad, no white or black, no beautiful or ugly, no great or small. If one only knows that the universe is but as small as a tare seed, and the tip of a hair is as large as a mountain, then one may be said to have seen the relativity of things. In that vague entirety no form is permanent, and none so unique that it cannot pass into another in the leisurely cycle of evolution. The seeds of things are multitudinous and minute. On the surface of the water they form a membranous texture. When they reach to where the land and water join, they become the lichens that form the clothes of frogs and oysters. Coming to life on mounds and heights, they become the plantain, and receiving manure appear as crow's feet. The roots of the crow's foot become grubs, and its leaves butterflies. This butterfly is changed into an insect and comes to life under a furnace. Then it has the form of a moth. The mother, after 1,000 days, becomes a bird. The Yin Shi united with the bamboo produces the King Ning. This the panther the horse, and the horse the man. Man then enters into the great machinery of evolution, from which all things come forth, and which they enter at death. It is not as clear as Darwin, but it will serve. In this endless cycle man himself may pass into other forms. His present shape is transient, and from the viewpoint of eternity may be only superficially real, part of Maya's deceptive veil of indifference. Once upon a time I, Zhuangzi, dreamt I was a butterfly, fluttering hither and thither, to all intents and purposes a butterfly. I was conscious only of following my fancies as a butterfly, and was unconscious of my individuality as a man. Suddenly I awoke, and there I lay myself again. Now I do not know whether I was then a man dreaming that I was a butterfly, or whether I am now a butterfly dreaming that I am a man. Death is therefore only a change of form, possibly for the better. It is, as Ibsen was to say, the great button-moulder who fuses us again in the furnace of change. Zhe Lai fell ill and lay gasping at the point of death, while his wife and children stood around him weeping. Li went to ask for him and said to them, "Hush, get out of the way. Do not disturb him in his process of transformation." Then, leaning against the door, he spoke to the dying man. Zhe Lai said, "A man's relations with the yin and the yang is more than that to his parents. If they are hastening my death, and I do not obey, I shall be considered unruly. There is the great mass of nature that makes me carry this body, labor with this life, relax in old age, and rest in death. Therefore that which has taken care of my birth is that which will take care of my death. Here is a great founder casting his metal. If the metal dancing up and down should say, 'I must be made into a moye,' a famous old sword, the great founder would surely consider this metal an evil one. So, if merely because one has once assumed the human form, one insists on being a man and a man only, the author of transformation will be sure to consider this one an evil being. Let us now regard heaven and earth as a great melting pot, and the author of transformation as a great founder, and wherever we go shall we not be at home? Quiet is our sleep, and calm is our awakening." When Zhuang himself was about to die, his disciples prepared for him a ceremonious funeral, but he bade them desist. "With heaven and earth for my coffin and shell, with the sun, moon, and stars as my burial regalia, and with all creation to escort me to the grave, are not my funeral paraphernalia ready to hand?" The disciples protested that unburied he would be eaten by the carrion birds of the air, to which Zhuang answered with the smiling irony of all his words, "Above ground I shall be food for kites, below I shall be food for mole crickets and ants. Why rob one to feed the other?" If we have spoken at such length of the ancient philosophers of China, it is partly because the insoluble problems of human life and destiny irresistibly attract the inquisitive mind, and partly because the lore of her philosophers is the most precious portion of China's gift to the world. Long ago, in 1697, the cosmic-minded Leibniz, after studying Chinese philosophy, appealed for the mingling and cross-fertilization of East and West. "The condition of affairs among ourselves," he wrote, in terms which have been useful to every generation, "is such that in view of the inordinate lengths to which the corruption of morals has advanced, I think it almost necessary that Chinese missionaries should be sent to us to teach us the aim and practice of national theology. For I believe that if a wise man were to be appointed judge of the goodness of peoples, he would award the golden apple to the Chinese." He begged Peter the Great to build a land route to China, and he promoted the foundation of societies in Moscow and Berlin for the opening up of China and the interchange of civilizations between China and Europe. In 1721, Christian Wolff made an attempt in this direction by lecturing at Halle on the practical philosophy of the Chinese. He was accused of atheism and dismissed, but when Frederick mounted the throne he called him to Prussia and restored him to honor. The Enlightenment took up Chinese philosophy at the same time that it carved out Chinese gardens and adorned its homes with chinoiserie. The physiocrats seem to have been influenced by Lao Tse and Zhuangzi in their doctrine of laissez-faire, and Rousseau at times talked so like the old master that we at once correlate him with Lao Tse and Zhuang, as we should correlate Voltaire with Confucius and Mencius, if these had been blessed with wit. "I have read the books of Confucius with attention," said Voltaire. "I have made extracts from them. I have found in them nothing but the purest morality, without the slightest tinge of charlatanism." Goethe, in 1770, recorded his resolution to read the philosophical classics of China, and when the guns of half the world resounded at Leipzig 43 years later, the old sage paid no attention to them, being absorbed in Chinese literature. May this brief and superficial introduction lead the reader on to study the Chinese philosophers themselves, as Goethe studied them, and Voltaire and Tolstoy. Chapter 24. The Age of the Poets. 1. China's Bismarck. The Period of Contending States. The Suicide of Chu Ping. Shi Huang unifies China. The Great Wall. The Burning of the Books. The Failure of Shi Huang. Presumably Confucius died an unhappy man, for philosophers love unity, and the nation that he had sought to unite under some powerful dynasty persisted in chaos, corruption, and division. When the great unifier finally appeared and succeeded, by his military and administrative genius, in welding the states of China into one, he ordered that all existing copies of Confucius's books should be burned. We may judge the atmosphere of this period of the contending states from the story of Chu Ping. Having risen to promise as a poet and to high place as an official, he found himself suddenly dismissed. He retired to the countryside and contemplated life and death beside a quiet brook. "Tell me," he asked an oracle, "whether I should steadily pursue the path of truth and loyalty, or follow in the wake of a corrupt generation. Should I work in the fields with spade and hoe, or seek advancement in the retinue of a grandee? Should I court danger with outspoken words, or fawn in false tones upon the rich and great? Should I rest content in the cultivation of virtue, or practice the art of wheedling women in order to secure success? Should I be pure and clean-handed in my rectitude, or an oil-mouthed, slippery, time-serving sycophant?" He dodged the dilemma by drowning himself, circa 350 B.C., and until our own day the Chinese people celebrated his fame annually in the Dragon Boat Festival, during which they searched for his body in every stream. The man who unified China had the most disreputable origin that the Chinese historians could devise. Shi Huang, we are informed, was the illegitimate son of the Queen of Qin, one of the western states, by the noble minister Lu, who was wont to hang 1,000 pieces of gold at his gate as a reward to any man who should better his compositions by so much as a single word. His son did not inherit these literary tastes. Shi reports Sima Qian forced his father to suicide, persecuted his mother, and descended the ducal throne when he was 12 years of age. When he was 25, he began to conquer and annex the petty states into which China had so long been divided. In 230 B.C. he conquered Han, in 228 Zhao, in 225 Wei, in 223 Chu, in 222 Yan, finally in 221 the important state of Qi. For the first time in many centuries, perhaps for the first time in history, China was under one rule. The conqueror took the title of Shi Huang and turned to the task of giving the new empire a lasting constitution. A man with a very prominent nose, with large eyes, with the chest of a bird of prey, with the voice of a jackal, without beneficence, and with the heart of a tiger or a wolf. This is the only description that the Chinese historians have left us of their favorite enemy. He was a robust and obstinate soul, recognizing no god but himself, and pledged, like some Nietzschean Bismarck, to unify his country by blood and iron. Having forged and mounted the throne of China, one of his first acts was to protect the country from the barbarians on the north by piecing together and completing the walls already existing along the frontier. And he found the multitude of his domestic opponents a convenient source of recruits for this heroic symbol of Chinese grandeur and patience. The Great Wall, 1,500 miles long, and adorned at intervals with massive gateways in the Assyrian style, is the largest structure ever reared by man. Beside it, said Voltaire, the pyramids of Egypt are only puerile and useless masses. It took 10 years and countless men. It was the ruin of one generation, say the Chinese, and the salvation of many. It did not quite keep out the barbarians, as we shall see, but it delayed and reduced their attacks. The Huns, barred for a time from Chinese soil, moved west into Europe and down into Italy. Rome fell because China built a wall. Meanwhile, Shi Huangti, like Napoleon, turned with pleasure from war to administration and created the outlines of the future Chinese state. He accepted the advice of his legalist prime minister, Li Shu, and resolved to base Chinese society not as heretofore upon custom and local autonomy, but upon explicit law and a powerful central government. He broke the power of the feudal barons, replaced them with a nobility of functionaries appointed by the national ministry, placed in each district a military force independent of the civil governor, introduced uniform laws and regulations, simplified official ceremonies, issued a state coinage, divided most of the feudal estates, prepared for the prosperity of China by establishing peasant proprietorship of the soil, and paved the way for a completer unity by building great highways in every direction from his capital at Yan'an. He established this city with many palaces, and persuaded the 120,000 richest and most powerful families of the empire to live under his observant eye. Traveling in disguise and unarmed, he made note of abuses and disorders, and then issued unmistakable orders for their correction. He encouraged science and discouraged letters. For the men of letters, the poets, the critics, the philosophers, above all the Confucian scholars, were his sworn foes. This book is continued on Cassette 7, Side 1.